going to be just a quick video on the normal curve. And before you can do anything with the curve, you first need to check that it's the nearly normal condition. So it has to be unimodal, and it needs to be symmetric. And if those two things occur, then you're able to go on to the next step. And again, the best way to do this is to look at the histogram. So when you're given a data set, you'll plug the numbers in, you will look at the plot and see whether or not it looks unimodal and whether or not it looks roughly symmetric. If it does, then what we could do is we can apply the normal curve. And before we learn about the normal curve, we need to learn about the standard normal model. When you have this, and when we have any of our curves, the mean is always in the middle. And then there's 3 tick marks to each side. And each tick mark is 1 standard deviation away. So this is +1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, 3 standard deviations. And what we'll learn is that most of the data is within 3 standard deviations. And if things are outside of 3 standard deviations, that means they're really abnormal. Okay, so I'm going to try and draw my bell curve. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it just should hump around the mean. Okay. Now, what applies here is something called the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. And this kind of tells you where everything is. When you're 1 standard deviation from the mean, so let's draw that line, 68% of the data lies there. So 68% of your data will lie within 1 standard deviation of the mean. When we go out to the 2nd standard deviation, 95% of the data is there, and you can tell my curve is really off. I guess it should go up like this. Okay. But again, the curve is not as important as understanding the process. And then when I'm within 3 standard deviations, 99.7% of our data is there. So if you ever have anything outside of 3 standard deviations from the mean, that tells you that that only happens 0.3% of the time. So whenever you're looking at things, when we create our normal model, you always have to start off with the mean, and then you count out by standard deviations. Okay? So what we're going to do is I'm going to have you model one, and we're going to draw one. And so I'm just going to make these numbers up. Let's say the mean was 18, and the standard deviation is 3. So what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video, and I want you to draw a normal curve, just like this one here, but using this number, these 2 numbers. Okay, so pause the video, and then come back, and you should have it. Okay, all right, so what you should have is your curve, and remember the mean is always in the middle, and then I just go out by standard deviation, so you should have had a 21, 24, and 27, and then I subtract 3 the other way, and it's 15, 12, and 9. The standard deviation is kind of like telling you the bins. It's telling you where to count your bins at, okay? Now, when I ask you to label the curve, you also need to include these percents. So you should have said this middle percent is 68% of the data. The 2nd standard deviation, that's 95% of the data. And then the 3rd standard deviation is 99.7% of the data. So when it asks you to sketch a normal curve for a model, or a normal model, this is what you do. You label the mean, count the standard deviations, and put your percents in. And that's it.